Hello everyone, welcome to the next season of Tata Katha. We are delighted to have with us Mr. Harish Bhat, currently brand custodian Tata Sons and the former managing director Tata Global Beverages and former chief operating officer of Titan Watches and Jewelry. He has written a wonderful book called Tata Stories, which I am showing here, which has 40 timeless tales to inspire you. Welcome, Mr. Harish Bhat.
Thank you, Girish. It's such a pleasure and privilege to be on your platform today and to talk about my new book, Tata Stories. I'm hoping that we will have a very engaging conversation for all our viewers about these 40 little-known tales from the history of the Tata.
So one thing I must confess is that what has really made me very happy is that the stories are so very pointed, so very inspiring, and it covers a very vast canvas. And more than that, this is a book that I could give it to my mother as well as give it to my twins. And both of them were able to read it. And the best thing about the book is that, these stories are about 4 or 5 pages. They're very precise. The font size is appropriate. And everyone has his or her own, area of interest that they can read. So, for example, my daughter liked the story on the race, which was JRE Tata's competition with this one. And my mother read about Lady Meherbai Tata. And these are the stories which I told them that, they might find it interesting. So kudos to you, sir, on this accomplishment.
Girish, it's very interesting that you mentioned that. It is true. This book has been read by young students, by young professionals, by middle-aged people like me, by elders. Many people have gifted it to their fathers or grandfathers. And I'll tell you the reason why these stories cut across all age groups. Because they're not just corporate stories, they're stories about the human spirit. So what Tata Stories has is actually, what Tata Stories has is stories of, human achievement, of success, of failure, of dreams, of passions, of how people overcame challenges. And these, you will agree with me, Girish, are appropriate for any age. So in a sense, in writing this book, I have tried to put forward a genre of corporate short stories, which can appeal across all age groups and which leave a lesson behind. When you read each story, they should leave a lesson behind that you can use in your own life. That's what I've tried.
Which brings me to my first question, sir. In your book, you have covered multiple leaders, including the chairman, Mr. Xerxes Tata, Mr. JRE Tata, as well as exceptionally talented Tata leaders like Mr. Russi Modi, Mr. Darbari Seth, Mr. Sumant Moolgaokar, as well as towering intellectual powerhouses like Mr. Nani Palkhivala, Mr. John Mathai, as well as Lady Meherbai Tata. So two things, sir, that stand out for me. One is the ability of the House of TATAs to attract such talent and to retain such talent. And also the fact that many of them are not necessarily from the business houses or from the business stream. If you look at Mr. Nani Palkhivala, he was a jurist par excellence. Mr. John Mathai was from the administrative service or went on to join the government. And Lady Meherbai Tata was from the family itself. So we wanted to have your views on what is it in the House of Tatas that attracts, nurtures, and makes these leaders into what they become.
So that's an interesting question, Girish. As a business historian, I have tried paying attention to this question. And how come the Tata Group over 153 years has continued to attract leadership of the finest quality? It's not just the people you mentioned. Going way back in the 1890s, Xerxes Tata was able to bring to India Charles Page Perrin to create Tata Steel, one of the best engineers of his time. And then going into the 1930s, for instance, in the book, I have narrated the story of Neville Vincent, whom JRD Tata was able to attract into the Tata Group to create Tata Airlines, which later became Air India. And all the names you mentioned, of course, what is very important is the leadership of the group, the chairman, Jamshedji Tata, Dravji Tata, JRD Tata, Mr. Ratan Tata, now Mr. Chandrasekhar. And, they kind of set the ethos of the group and they live the spirit and the philosophy of the group. So one reason that I think the Tata Group is able to attract very good leadership is because of the very strong levels of belief and conviction that our chairman have had over the course of so many years. There is a story here about how Jamshedji Tata attracts Charles Page Perrin to India to set up Tata Steel. It's a magical story. You should read it in TataStories. It's very much in this book. And I'm amazed each time I read it that Charles Page Perrin left the luxuries of New York to come to the jungles of Eastern India to establish Tata Steel and help Jamshedji establish Tata Steel. But the reason for that, and Charles Page Perrin says this himself, was the conviction and belief that he saw in Jamshedji's voice. And he goes on to say, I also saw kindness in his eyes. Okay, so that is the reason that he came to India. And that's, I think, also the reason that many other Tata leaders have joined the Tata Group. The strong belief and conviction of the chairman of the group who lead this group forward. So some of the names that you mentioned, people like Nani Palkhivala, people like Dr. John Mathai, while I have not had the opportunity to interview them, but from my readings, it's clear that one of the reasons they joined the Tata Group and worked with it for much of their career is because of the respect and regard they had for JRD Tata, for JRD Tata's beliefs and convictions. That, I think, is an underlying reason. The other underlying reason, Girish, that you see through the history of the Tata Group, and I could see it very clearly while researching TataStories. The other underlying reason is one of the key facets of the Tata Group has been nation building. Whether it was Tata Steel, whether it was Tata Airlines, whether it was Tata Motors, or the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, or the Indian Institute of Science, or Tata Salt, or Tata Consultancy Services, every major project undertaken by the Tata Group over the years was done first and foremost because the Tatas thought it would serve a national purpose and be good for the community and the nation. That is a very powerful philosophy which pulls in exceedingly good talent, because when you work for the Tata Group, you think you're working for the Tata Group all right, but you think you're also serving the needs of the nation. And that is captured very well by none other than Mahatma Gandhi. When Mahatma Gandhi visited Jamshedpur in the year 1925, he delivered an address there. And I'm going to read out the last few words of that address, the last line of the address. He says, may God grant you that in serving the Tatas, you will also serve India and will always realize that you're here for a much higher mission than merely working for an industrial enterprise. I think working for that much higher mission of nation building is a very, very powerful draw, which brings the best intellects, the best minds to come and work and stay with the group. So that I think is the second reason that people like Sumant Moolgaokar, Nani Palkhivala, Darbari Seth, you spoke about Dr. John Mathai, all of them professionals in diverse fields who have joined and stayed with the group for a very, very long time. The third reason, Girish, I would say is the Tata Group gives its leaders adequate space and empowerment to do what they are best at doing. I have seen this through the annals of our history. And if you look at these leaders, who are not chairman of the group, but they're very senior in the group: Sumant Moolgaokar, Darbari Seth, Rusi Modi, Nani Palkhivala, Xerxes Desai. Each of them is a very different individual from the other. But each of them has got the space and empowerment to do what he is best at. Sumant Moolgaokar is a stickler for perfection, for engineering excellence. Xerxes Desai has an eye for design and for the aesthetics and a very good sense of the consumer. You have Nani Palkhivala, a towering intellectual whose interests are in constitutional law, corporate law, taxation, economics, diplomacy. But each of them has got the space to do what they're really good at and use what they're really good at to contribute to the betterment of the group and the nation. So those, I think, Girish, are the three reasons that occur to me why the Tata Group has been able to attract towering intellectuals, very talented managers and leaders, and continues to do so until today. I'm amazed by the pipeline of leadership that the Tata Group has had over the years and continues to have today.
Yes, sir, indeed. In fact, the last great person who had joined the Tata Group was none other than the current Minister for External Affairs, who had joined the Tatas as president, I think, for strategic global issues, Mr. Dr. S. Jaishankaran.
That is true. Dr. Jaishankar was my colleague in the Tata Group for some time, and he was in charge of all our international offices before, he's gone back to the government now as the cabinet minister for external affairs, and we're very proud of that. Equally, when I look at people like our current group chairman, Mr. Chandrasekharan, who has been with the group for over 3.5 decades now, I look at my colleagues who are heading Tata Group companies, all the major Tata Group companies, you see some powerful talent there. You see some powerful talent, but married with that powerful talent is a huge sense of commitment to the group and to the nation. In the stories that I have written in this book, of course, I have covered primarily stories of the JRD Tata era, of the Jamshedji Tata era, of the Dorabji Tata era, some stories of the Ratan Tata era. So all the leaders that you come across in this book present the same facility. People who thought they were working for a higher mission, for nation building, got empowerment in space, had a high degree of regard and respect for the chairman under whom they served. And that combination, I think, Girish, creates magic.
Very true, sir. In fact, I recall reading, I think, in Beyond the Last Blue Mountain by R.M. Lala, something that Mr. J.R.E. Tata had said when he addressed one of the batches of the Tata Administrative Service, wherein he said that your loyalty should not be only to the company, but to a greater cause and to a larger issue of mankind, humanity, and of course, India. That was one. And second also is that I think, like you also mentioned, that the company has given adequate space to all its leaders, and perhaps in their initial phases of their career made it also a little safe for them to fail, so that they understand from their mistakes and then they are able to serve for much greater tenures. One of the things that struck me when I was reading about both Mr. Nani Palkhivala and John Mathai was a commonality. Both of them were exceptional lawyers. Both of them excelled in their own fields. Mr. Nani Palkhivala was an eminent jurist. I still recall in the late 1980s and early 1990s, there was this book that he had written on income tax, and the stadium full of meetings that he used to have there commenting on the budget, which used to appear on the next day in Times of India. And he would rip apart the finance ministers, irrespective of who the finance minister was. And he was very vocal in his criticism of certain things. And he was also very sharp in pointing out the contradictions in the budget. If you have given a subsidy for something here, you are then taxing it somewhere else. So he was pretty sharp in that. And both Mr. Nani Palkhivala and Dr. John Mathai, sir, if you recall, both of them intellectually very powerful, very hardworking people. Both worked with the Tatas. Both were taken away from the Tatas and went and joined the government of India. Both of them got disillusioned with the government of India and were welcomed back into the House of TATAs. And post-retirement, both of them had to say that perhaps the best thing in their lives was the tenure that they spent with the Tatas. And therefore, the company continues being a great nurturing ground for people who think about the nation first. And you yourself, sir, have had an exceptionally great career within the House of Tatas and have contributed significantly to the growth of Titan as well as Tata Global Beverages. What do you think, sir, are the key takeaways which young managers can take away from the leadership stories of the Tata Group, or the leaders of the Tata Group?
So let me stay on the two leaders whose names you mentioned, Girish. Let me stay on Nani Palkhivala and Dr. John Mathai. Okay. One takeaway for me from both their lives and careers has been their absolute intellectual integrity. They had certain beliefs and certain value systems, and they would not move away from them. Let me take Nani Palkhiwala's case. In Nani Palkhiwala's case, he brought a huge amount of intellectual integrity to those budget speeches that you mentioned just now. Those were immensely popular budget speeches. In fact, the budget speeches in Bombay were held in the Brabourne Stadium, and the stadium used to be chock-a-block full. And like you rightly said, Nani Palkhivala would dissect the budget. And regardless of whoever was the finance minister of that age, he would give his very, very objective views and critique of the budget without seeking fear or fame. And I think that intellectual honesty marked out the man. Similarly, if you look at Nani Palkhivala's history, at personal risk to himself, he decided to withdraw his brief for Indira Gandhi as a lawyer when he was unhappy with the fact that she had declared a state of emergency. That is intellectual integrity once again. Look at Dr. John Mathai. Dr. John Mathai joined the government as the Minister for Railways and Transport in the interim government of India, 1946-47. He then held the Commerce and Industry portfolio, and eventually he was elevated to serve as the Minister for Finance. But when he developed differences with Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, because he felt that India was not ready for a planning commission and centralized planning in those early years, he resigned from the government, resigned as Minister of Finance, and as a matter of principle, and returned to the Tata Group in 1950. So one lesson I take out from these episodes is the need for us as managers and leaders to be intellectually honest to ourselves. That marks out great leaders, because then people develop the trust that you're actually saying what you think and believe. And that's I think, a lesson from both their lives. But one other lesson for me from Nani Palkhivala's life and Dr. John Mathai's life is that they also worked very hard to leverage their potential. They went out of their way to work very hard. And let me explain why I'm saying this. Nani Palkhivala was, of course, a towering intellectual, very talented man, but he could not have achieved what he achieved without working very hard. Even at the young age of 29, he worked for 12 to 15 hours a day to write his first book, which you referred to, The Law and Practice of Income Tax, co-authored with Jamshedji Kanga, which veritably became a Bible for income taxation in the country. And later on, I am told, he would work at one thing at a time relentlessly. Sometimes he would begin a legal draft at 10:30 and complete it at 4:30 the next morning. So that capacity for hard work, the same hard work went into Dr. John Mathai's drafting of the Bombay Plan. He was the key person who drafted the plan. And as J.R.D. Tata later said about him, Dr. John Mathai was one of the architects of creating this plan itself. And as Dr. John Mathai himself says, I was never called upon to compromise on any matters, nor once was I asked to do anything which I could not justify to my conscience. And the work was very interesting. They maintain a very high standard of business. That's how we describe the Tata Group. And he himself worked very hard towards the tenure. So I don't want to take out too many lessons of leadership, but two lessons I would take out are intellectual integrity on one side from both these people. And the second is just the capability to work very hard, which you need to leverage what you're really good at. Everyone who's listening to this show is good at something or the other. Some people are expert marketers. Some people aspire to be, expert finance professionals. Others aspire to be expert lawyers. Whatever you want to do, or expert engineers, whatever you want to do in your career, it's important to work doubly hard to realize what your true potential is and unlock it. I still remember a famous poem, that I used to read in my school days, where it goes like this, Girish. The heights that great men reached and kept were not attained by sudden flight, but they, while their companions slept, were toiling upward in the night. That is hard work, and hard work is what true leadership is built in, hard work and intellectual integrity. So I want to stay with these two lessons. Of course, there are lessons on people leadership. There are lessons on strategy, which other stories bring out in Tata Stories. There are lessons on perfection and the need for excellence. But from Nani Palkhivala and from Dr. John Mathai, these two lessons, intellectual integrity and the capacity to work very, very hard, are essentially lessons for anyone who wants to become a leader in his or her own right.
I think it also speaks volumes about the House of TATAs, that at a time when people who have fallen out of favor with the government are shunned by their own colleagues and shunned by their own people, the House of Tata should have that standing to be able to take back these people into prominent roles and not have any fear of retaliation from the government for these kind of things?
Yeah, I think the House of Tatas has recognized that good leadership comes in all forms. Good leadership is diverse, comes from a diverse set of backgrounds, and the House of Tatas has always gone. I think in my role as a brand historian and based on my research, always gone objectively with what the strengths of those leaders are. And if you take four generations of the Tata Group, Jamshedji Tata, Dorabji Tata, JRD Tata, and Ratan Tata, you will find the same thread running through those entire histories. People who have great strengths, who bring those great professional strengths to the table and help craft a leadership team which can really the group go into the next horizon or the next generation.
Sir, you have also covered Lady Meherbai Tata in your book, and I found that she was quite a staunch nationalist and quite famous for donating the Jubilee Diamond for the cause of seeking funds for Tata Steel. Could you tell us a little bit more about her?
Yeah. So Girish, Lady Meherbai Tata was a fascinating woman, a fascinating leader. She was born in 1879 and went on to become a very feisty pioneer in the cause of women's rights in India. She was married to Sir Dorabji Tata, the second chairman of the Tata Group. She was a very versatile, intelligent, and accomplished lady, a very keen sportsperson, an accomplished pianist. The government consulted her on the Milestone Act, which made child marriage illegal in India. You're quite right. One of the stories that many viewers may be aware is how she donated her or pledged her Jubilee Diamond, the sixth largest diamond in the world, to raise funds for Tata Steel and to stave it off from collapse. That is the subject of another story altogether. But the reason I think people should know the story of Lady Meherbai Tata, Girish, is I believe she was one of India's first feminist icons. And I think she is a role model for everyone, including for young women professionals in today's day and age. That's what I'd like to say. I've written a couple of fascinating stories about her in this book.
Thank you so much for that, sir. Very insightful. We are also pleased to have with us today Sri Lakshmi Hariharan, the General Manager for Corporate Brand and Marketing with the Tata Group. Welcome, Sri.
Hi, Krish, and thanks for having me over.
I believe you have done some exceptionally good research on Lady Meherbai Tata. We shall be happy if you could share with us a few contents of what you have covered till now.
Sure, happy to. And it's actually a very fascinating story. And the more I read about Lady Tata and about her life and her work, the more I started getting very inspired by her. And let me tell you a couple of aspects of her life which deeply touched me. So one, she was a very strong, she was a nationalist, and her love for India and her love for her heritage and her roots were very high. As you had mentioned earlier, that at a very young age of maybe even she was just 5 at that point of time, where she decided that she was going to retain her original Indian name, which is Mary. And incidentally, Mary means compassionate, which I think is a very true reflection of her own personality. The second thing, very interestingly, is that there are some photos we came across of her playing tennis, and she was a very accomplished tennis player. She won more than 60 or 65 prizes in tennis. She was always a constant presence in watching the Wimbledon along with Sir Dorabji Tata. And she was also one of the first Indian women to be drawn to play at the Olympics, at the Paris Olympics in 1924. She didn't eventually play, we don't know why. But the interesting part of her playing these tournaments was she always played in her Parsi sari. It's a very beautiful and a fascinating photo to see her playing tennis in her full Parsi sari. And she used to wear the sari wherever she went, even when she traveled abroad, when she met the US president, when she met the British Queen. She used to always be in her Indian attire. So she was a very proud nationalist. And I think the second aspect of her, which again really inspires me, is she was a champion of women's causes. she believed that a nation can advance only if the women of the nation take their true place in the country's affairs. And she dedicated her life to improve the quality of life of the women in the nation and to give women an identity and a voice. She actively championed to introduce the Sharada Act, which was to raise the age of, it was against child marriage, and it was to raise the age of marriage for children. She actively campaigned against, she spoke against the Parda system, untouchability, and she was quite blind to race, religion, caste, because she felt that if you're going to help someone, you're not helping at all if you start looking at these aspects of it. So she was very compassionate, and she was the bridge between the rich and the poor, the educated and the illiterate. And she had the understanding, the empathy, and the compassion to actually reveal or explain the truth, the life truths of each to the other. And she was a very spirited voice of change, which she gave Indian women an identity, a voice. She helped Indian women value themselves and see their potential. So I think in all these aspects, she was a remarkable woman of her time. And although while there are a lot of parks, memorials being set up in her name, the modern Indian woman, I think, is the true living memorial of her life and work.
Thank you so much, Sri. That was indeed very fascinating to know. I also think it speaks volumes of her confidence in her ability to win matches, because it's not very easy to run around in a sari on a tennis court, especially when the other side is not wearing a sari. You know, the other person would probably be in trousers or skirts, and then to run all the way across the length and breadth of the court in a sari and to be able to win matches is exceptional. Three, I also think that humility is a great virtue with both Lady Meherbai Tata as well as with Mr. Nani Palkhivala. I remember reading in the book of Mr. Nani Palkhiwala's gesture of escorting visitors to the lift, irrespective of his time schedule, as well as of the donation of rupees 2 CR that he made to the Shankaran Netralaya in Chennai and to Dr. Badrinath, who was its founder. So your views on this, Sri?
Yes, I think that you're absolutely right. The spirit of humility is something that we see in all Tata leaders, even right from Mr. like you mentioned, Mr. Nani Palkhivala, or even Lady Meherbai Tata, or even today, our leaders. And here I just want to take the opportunity to maybe narrate one incident which reflected Lady Tata's also humility. So she was known to she herself was known to see all her guests or receive all her guests whenever they used to come visit her home personally, whoever they were. And there's a very beautiful incident that is actually written in the book in #TataStories about a time when the late 1920s or so, there was some riots in Bombay, and there was this area in Baikula which were cordoned off, and people couldn't access. People were struggling to access vegetables and fruits and so on. So she said, we need to help those women there. We need to help the people there. And she went to the mayor. She led a delegation of women to the mayor of the city of Bombay and requested permission to sell vegetables. And I mentioned specifically sell because even at that point of time, she believed that people have their people need to have their pride, and we shouldn't be looking at being seen as giving charity. Everybody has their own pride. Let's sell the vegetables at cost price. And the mayor, in fact, was quite flabbergasted. He said, but how can you women, you're all high society women, and how can you all be seen giving, selling vegetables? It won't look nice. It won't look graceful. And Lady Tata, in her quiet dignity, she just goes up and she told him that we ladies are not here to be graceful. We're here to be useful. So imagine that a woman of her stature, she did not hesitate in actually going and being there herself and selling vegetables to a riot-ridden city and a place, simply because she believed that everybody has a right to dignity. And it's a remarkable quality that I see in all our leaders as we look back over the past decade and even today, in fact.
Thank you so much for that, Sri. I would also request Mr. Bhat, an exceptional leader himself, to speak a few words on humility as a value in the leadership system.
So, Girish, I was struck as I was researching Tata Stories and going through, all the stories, literally all these stories in the book. I was struck by exactly what Sri Lakshmi said just now, the thread of humility and grace running through all our leaders. Humility is, I think, the mark of a great leader. Because a great leader will always relate to people at their own levels and always treat people around him, people working with him, or his peers with the same respect and regard. Humility leads to that mutual respect and regard. And humility also, makes the leader far more accessible to others. A leader with humility is not sitting on a high perch. He's a leader, or he or she is a leader who is accessible. Just like Lady Meherbai Tata wanted to be accessible to those women who were hit by riots in Baikula by going there to sell vegetables to them. Or just like Nani Palkhivala used to walk his visitors to the lift each time they came to Bombay House. One other story about Nani Palkhivala in that regard is he used to deliver these budget speeches at the Brabant Stadium. And the story was narrated to me by my senior colleague, Farooq Subedar, who's had the opportunity to work with Nani Palkhivala. He used to reach the stadium to deliver his speech exactly on the dot of time, because he thought he should respect the time of others. And if the stadium was overflowing with people, he used to call young people to come and sit on the dais to listen to his lecture. Now, that again is a mark of mutual respect and humility. So I believe there is a lot of work which has happened on this. There are studies which have been done by Harvard Business School and by other management institutions. But I think humility marks out great leaders. And I'm so proud that the Tata Group across generations and until today has had leaders who have been very firm, very determined, a lot of conviction and belief in what they do, but at the same time, act with humility and grace. So you're quite right, humility is an essential trait of a very, very successful leadership, which wants to make everyone they work with inclusive and who want to treat people with mutual respect. This is a trait that stands out. Certainly in my research for this book, I came across the same trait across several leaders.
Thank you so much, Mr. Harish Bhat and Sri Lakshmi, for being with us for this episode of Tata Katha, Season 2. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be back with you on another episode of Tata Katha soon, wherein we'll speak on nation building. See you soon. Thank you so much.